Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about some of the main branches of philosophy. Sort of what are the main issues that we're concerned with when we're taking a class, when you're taking a class like this. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list. However, these are the main sort of issues that I think are important for you to think about. And certainly some of the areas that we're going to talk about here do overlap in a lot of ways. So I don't want to suggest that these are entirely isolated or separate from each other. There's a lot of interface between the different branches we're going to consider. So the first area that I want to direct your attention to is what we call metaphysics. Now, metaphysics is essentially the study of reality, or what's the most fundamental aspects of reality. Sort of fundamentality. We get the name metaphysics from Aristotle, not directly Aristotle, but his pupils who compiled his works together after he died. Aristotle had written quite a bit about the natural world. He was sort of one of the first natural philosophers, or what we might think of today as a scientist. And so he was working on things like biology and examining the way the world works, the way the stars or the heavenly bodies move throughout the night sky. And his pupils, his followers, compiled all these work together and called it the physics. Not physics like we think of today, contemporary physics studying the laws of the universe, but rather the natural world itself. And he did quite a bit of other work as well, where he was considering what he calls being qua being, or the most fundamental levels of existence. And so when his followers put these pieces of work together, it came after the physics. And so they literally called it metaphysics, meaning after the physics. But since Aristotle thought of this as the study of the most fundamental things that exist, we get the word ontology, which is another way of thinking about what we're doing when we're doing metaphysics. Ontology is the study of existence. The study of what exists. So if you think that God exists, then that would be on your list of what exists, right? So that would be a part of metaphysics. If you think that we have free will in some sense, then again, that would be within the domain of metaphysics. And so these are the sort of issues. There may be many more that we can consider, but this is a general way of thinking about what we're doing when we're doing metaphysics. The next area that I want to discuss is epistemology. Now, epistemology literally means the study of knowledge. It comes from the Greek. And so epistemology is generally thinking about the nature of knowledge. What does it take to know something? Right? So the study of knowledge, and when we're doing epistemology, we're thinking about the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to count as knowledge. So what is the nature of knowledge? How do I know such and such? And for us, a very specific and important issue within epistemology, goes all the way back to the Greeks, is what's called skepticism. Skepticism. Specifically, external world. Skepticism. External world skepticism has to do with how do I know things exist beyond my own mind. There's many other different things that we could talk about and think about with regard to epistemology, but this, again, gives you a general idea of what we'll be doing in this class. Another branch, I've kind of brought these two together because a lot of contemporary philosophers think of these two branches as being intimately connected, is the philosophy of mind and language. So in philosophy of mind, we think about what is the nature of the mind. Is there a distinction between the mind and the body, or the mind and the brain? This is what we call the mind-body problem, or the problem of mental causation. We think about what is the nature of thought, intentionality, what's the nature of beliefs, right? So these are all the sorts of things that we tend to think about with regard to philosophy of mind. And it's intimately connected to the nature of language, right? So when we think about how do words and sentences get meaning, how do, creatures like us, animals, have logos or rationality, right? So these are the sort of things that we are concerned with here. Nature of the mind, nature of thought and language, the relationship between the mind and body, again, there are quite a few other issues that we could include here. In contemporary philosophy of mind and language, we focus quite a bit on what's going on in cognitive science and psychology, with neurophilosophy and brain science. So there's quite a bit of work being done here. Another area in philosophy that we're concerned with is what's called ethics. All right, so ethics is broken up into three general camps, three general areas. One is what's called metaethics. A second is what's called value theory. And the third is what's called normative ethics. Right, so metaethics, value theory, and normative ethics. Metaethics is concerned with what makes something right or wrong, right? So if you say that stealing is morally wrong, then what makes that claim true? What makes it the case that something is wrong? If you think that it's morally right to give money to the poor, what makes that right? What makes that claim true? So what's the basis? What grounds morality? Value theory is concerned with the good, right? Living a good life, having, being happy, doing well with your life, living an excellent life. What is the nature of the good? Normative ethics is concerned with what actions are the right actions, what actions are the wrong actions. So if you want to know whether or not stealing is permissible in some situation, you consult the normative theory. Normative is basically a word that we use to mean ought, or what obligations we have, what you ought to do in some situation, what you're morally required to do in some situation, or maybe what you're morally prohibited from doing in some situation. Right, so that's what we mean by normative versus something that's descriptive. So those are the three main branches within ethics that we generally talk about. But there's other things that we might be concerned with too, like justice or social contracts. And this leads us to social and political philosophy. And this domain, we're thinking about things like what makes a good society. We might be concerned with things like the nature of rights, right? Do we have positive rights or only negative rights? We might be concerned with justice. We might be concerned with economic systems, with political systems, and the advantages and disadvantages of these. We might be concerned with things like equality or equity. These are the issues that we might be concerned with here. Finally, I do like to include what's called history of philosophy, which should be clearly distinguished from philosophy of history, right? The history of philosophy is where we're actually doing history. We're thinking about the dates and the cultural situations and what led up to those situations. We're thinking about the people that did certain things, the societies in which they lived. We're thinking about all the historical factors that are involved with whatever philosophical issue we're discussing. And that's different from the philosophy of history. Philosophy of history is where we're asking philosophical questions about the academic enterprise of history. right? So in the history of philosophy, we're going to think about history, right? What are the dates? What's the culture, society, and so on and so forth. Everything that we would do in history, but we would do it with regard to philosophical issues. And so really, the history of philosophy is very much like Western Civ or any other kind of a historical enterprise. Right, so that's a very broad and general overview of what's going on in all of these different domains. But I do want to mention one other thing here, which is perhaps maybe the most important branch of philosophy, the one that applies in every single one of them, and that's reason and logic. Right? So in every single one of these branches, we use reason and logic in order to do our investigation, in order to ask the questions and attempt to answer the questions. Right? We have to use inferences, and some of these different inferences involve deduction versus induction. We use different forms of evidence in order to make different claims, come to different conclusions, using different premises that support our conclusions. Right, so that's why reason and logic is so important. And this goes all the way back to the Greeks and the word logos. The word logos literally means speaking or speech. And so if you think about speech and speaking or communicating, using logic, this is something that's unique amongst humans. It's what separates us from all the other non-human animals. Well, to some extent, largely, right? In fact, Aristotle defined human beings as a rational animal. And what he means by this is an animal that has logos, an animal that has the ability to talk to each other, to use language, to speak with one another, to use logic, right? And so philosophy, it's not really going to count as philosophy if it lacks reason and lacks logic, the application of reason and logic. In fact, I'm very much convinced that you don't really understand, you're not really grasping any particular philosophical issue until you have a chance to consider the arguments for and against that particular issue. Right? So if you believe that we should live in a free society, then it's not enough to merely take that position. Right? If you believe that the government should not force us to wear masks, for example, it's not enough to just have that belief. You need to be able to consider the arguments for and against that belief. And it's only once you've considered and used logic, logos, only then can you really understand or grasp that very issue that you're concerned with. And so that's why logos, through reason and logic, applies universally across every single branch within philosophy.